Why did humans outcompete Neanderthals?
The big answer to why humans are different to other animals seems to be that we moved from a pure hardware-based system, genes and instincts and some individual learning, a little bit of fine-tuning, to a kind of software-based system. So we do have genes, they give us big brains, but those big brains allow us to learn new capacities, download new apps if you like. And cities are supercharged. And if we're talking about cultural software, this is how it gets written. New ideas are flowing in and out with new people bringing things. People are learning things from one another. And it's just sheer more experiments going on. That's also why I'm obsessed with charter cities, right? Because we don't have a lot of good models of development. Again, from a cultural evolutionary perspective, aid sucks. Yes, it can increase education. It can provide that, that impetus that might move a system out. But it often also does things like undermine farmers, right? Like, how do you compete with free food that's coming out of America that's producing way more? Whereas if it's the competition that's really going to drive this, if we look around the world, we see some success stories that seem, somewhat organic, like Japan to some degree. So an ecosystem of startup cities is like Silicon Valley, where they're learning from one another and they represent another model that could undermine these kind of autocratic, corrupt states. It's the best shot we have in the developed world. And the reason that it matters for a lot of people, when I talk to people, they're like, I just don't care about what's going on in Africa. And there's a good reason to care. And the reason is because other people's problems are very quickly going to be your problems.
Hi, Michael. Thanks for coming on the Charter Cities podcast.
Thanks for having me, Mark. Good to reconnect.
Yeah. So I guess my first question is, why did humans outcompete Neanderthals? Or how?
That's a really interesting question. So we don't definitely know the answer. The best answer we suspect is that we got good at learning from each other. So we had higher sociality effectively. So it seems like Neanderthals also went down. Let me go back a little bit. So the big answer to why humans are different to other animals seems to be that we moved from a pure hardware-based system where it's just like genes and instincts and some individual learning, a little bit of fine-tuning, to a kind of software-based system. So we do have genes, they give us big brains, but those big brains allow us to learn new capacities, download new apps if you like. It looks like Neanderthals probably had similar capacities just because they have indications of culture like making jewelry and stuff. But
My
what we were
understanding is that the Neanderthals actually had like bigger brains, or at least
brains.
bigger head sizes, right? I think there's a question of brain folds matter, and maybe their brains were smooth, so that they weren't smarter, but like they actually had higher cranial capacity than modern humans, which indicates like higher intelligence on some margin.
Right. Yeah, entirely possible that as individuals they were smarter than us individually. But the thing is, once you move to software, it opens these new capacities, and you don't need the overblown hardware because brain tissue is really expensive, right? 20 times as expensive as muscle tissue. And so just because we had larger groups, we had larger kind of collective brains, and that might have been what enabled us to outcompete the Neanderthals. So you got to remember, like, it seems like there's some indications that human brain size shrunk in the last 3,000 to 10,000 years. And yet we also seem to be getting smarter at the same time. Like our capacities as a collective and even as individuals went up despite our shrinking brains. So it seems like it's not the hardware that's doing the work here. It's the software.
Yeah, there was kind of a, what's his name? The Yale, he did Seeing Like a State. He died like a year ago.
Yeah.
Do you know what I'm talking about? What's his name?
Yeah, I do.
He had like 2 Cheers for Anarchy. James C. Scott. There we go. So in one of his books, he actually kind of talks about when you domesticate animals, right, their brain size shrinks. Because if it's a domesticated animal, they at that point, humans are basically breeding them to produce either meat or milk or like horsepower or whatever. Right, so they're getting optimized for that, and because humans defend them, they don't have to optimize for like fighting predators, escaping them, like chasing prey, or identifying which bushes are key to eating. And in the book, kind of James C. Scott like hints that like he doesn't like go out and say it, but he kind of like suggests that humans also domesticated ourselves, like when we developed agriculture. And like that was kind of always an interesting hypothesis. Like you mentioned that there is evidence that human brain size shrunk over the last like 3,000, 10,000 years. I wasn't, I guess, aware of that evidence. Are there other indications that like we domesticated ourselves?
Yeah, for sure. So Brian Harris has some nice work on this. Where so if you look at us, just look at us. Domestication also, has leads to these kind of neotenous features, right? Like dogs look like puppies, like they look like wolf puppies permanently, and we look like juvenile chimps. Like if you look at a child chimp, it doesn't have the protruding jaw, for example. It has this more flat face. So just physically, we look that way. But then we maintain these kind of childlike properties for most of our lives, right? Like we're we're man children to some degree. We're playful. We continue to learn. We're less aggressive. So there's all this kind of evidence that we self-domesticated, and we seem to do it by through kind of selecting out the super aggressive males in our group. Once you have things like projectile weapons and you start to cooperate with one another, if you have a male that's too aggressive and not in your favor, you can start to control them. So yeah, lots of evidence.
Yeah, I mean, you occasionally see they like, all right, dig up the, I don't know, 5,000, 10,000 year old body from like Central Asia of the, I'm going to mispronounce it, but like the Yamanya group. And they look kind of, yeah, I mean, more barbarian, right? Like protruding forehead, protruding jaw. It's hard to know, like, yeah, it is physiognomy real. Obviously, there's like something there, but like how to understand that. So your research kind of focuses on, I guess, like cultural evolution. My understanding is your PhD was in psychology, because there isn't really, I guess, a PhD in cultural evolution. And you've
Right.
got like an interesting background growing up, spending a decent amount of time in Botswana.
Yeah.
So can you, I guess, walk me through your story? Like, how'd you end up where you are, and kind of what excites you
Yeah.
about cultural evolution?
Yeah, right. So my family was from Sri Lanka. I was born there. Left when I was 2 years old. Grew up in Africa, in Botswana primarily, and this was a time when South Africa was ending apartheid. So I remember when Mandela was voted in. It was a very interesting time. And then we lived in Australia. We lived in Papua New Guinea. I've since lived in Canada, the States, and the UK. So my family was in Australia for quite some time, and that's where I did undergrad. And I did a degree in engineering in software and computer, and then I also did a second degree where I initially majored in psychology, and then got just super frustrated because I was like, "Oh my God, this stuff is it's not good science. It's a lot of advocacy. I'm really frustrated." So I ended up taking courses in like biology and philosophy and economics and political science and a bunch of other things. And eventually I just majored in cognitive psychology and started applying it to engineering design and was working on smart home technologies and audio interfaces for anesthesiology. But then, I what actually happened was I watched Al Gore's documentary, An Inconvenient Truth. And I watched it. So it was what, 2007 or something, right? So I watched
I
this
think it came
documentary.
out like 2001, 2002. Maybe
Was it
watched
that
it
late?
later. My understanding is it was like
Yeah.
just after he lost the 2000 election. Like he reinvented
Let me
himself
check.
pretty
Yeah.
quick.
2006. It came out in 2006. I
Okay,
Googled.
so okay, no, or maybe before the documentary came out, he was like going around
He
giving a
was doing the circuit. Yeah,
PowerPoint.
yeah, yeah. He was. He
Yeah,
was doing the talks.
and then the actual documentary came out a few years later. Okay.
Yeah, so I did catch all that, but I watched the documentary and I watched this thing and I was like, holy crap, like is this for real? Like are we in trouble? So I start reading like the IPCC reports and I'm like, oh, okay, they're talking about like climate wars and stuff like that. And then I was like, okay, but let's look at the Pentagon because they really have to think about national security. And they were also warning about, mass migration and all these things. And so my sense was, look, everybody's so focused on mitigation and maybe we're going to slow the economy to save the planet, but I don't think we are. And if we don't, we should really be thinking about what that means, right? And so started reading about like future projections about where we were headed, and it seemed to me like we don't have a good science for how to govern ourselves or how to develop growth or how to do any of this stuff. Like there's a push and pull, right? Like why are people streaming across the border in the southern United States or into the UK or into Europe? Because the places they're in suck, and they're going to suck more under climate change, when part of them are underwater or because of droughts and so on. So that's one part of it. And if we don't have a good science for how to govern ourselves, that seemed an issue. And because I was working on smart home tech, there's an area of engineering that some of your listeners might be familiar with called control theory, which is like the math of feedback loops. And I was like, oh, this seems like a useful thing to build a science of culture. Anyway, long story short, I run into Joe Henrich, who at the time he was cross-appointed in psych and economics at UBC. And so I flew, I rerouted on a business trip to Vancouver. So I actually flew to Ohio and back to Vancouver, back to Australia. And I caught up with Joe. And when I met Joe, I was like, I got to work with you because he's an aerospace engineer. I don't know if you knew that, but he's an aerospace engineer by training. He also had a degree in anthropology, and we were on the same wavelength. Because I had the undergrad in psych, I majored in psych, but I ended up taking graduate courses in economics and evolutionary biology and data science. I had no desire to be a professor. I was recently promoted to a full professor, and I had no desire to enter down this path. I just wanted to figure out this stuff and then go apply it in like a think tank or World Bank or whatever. But this seemed like a good venue. And so that's what I'm interested in cultural evolution. What I'm really interested in is I have no desire to publish papers. That's just a long way. I just want to figure stuff out and then go build it in the world because deep down I'm still an engineer.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because it sounds like part of it was the similar path, at least I took, or kind of economists take, which is like, why are some countries rich, other countries poor, right? Trying to understand why societies are like function the way they do. What are these kind of like underlying inputs that lead to these outcomes? But I don't know, as an economic imperialist, I think economics has most of the answers, but it's interesting that you kind of had the same questions, but moved in a kind of, right, like overlapping, but kind of different underlying idea of how to answer them.
Yeah. So I think right now I'm an economic psychologist. I have affiliations in developmental economics. I just certainly took courses, but in undergrad, it was actually Milton Friedman's 1953 essay that like irritated me, I think.
Was
So
that his the methodology essay?
yeah, it's the one where he says like, look, it doesn't matter that our assumptions don't make sense as long as the
Yeah,
predictions are good.
yeah,
And I read this, and I'm coming out of engineering. I'm like, dude, you're talking about like the Ptolemaic model. Like, our model of the solar system, it wasn't even the solar system, right? With the Earth in the center and the sun rotating around in circular orbits, really predictive. But it's got
right.
these little epicycles. It's nonsense. It's not how the world works. What we want is a kind of Kepler model. So it's not even the Copernican model. You want the sun in the center and you want elliptical orbits. And having grown up in a lot of these places, the economic answer seemed insufficient. Like I lived in places that had Westminster parliamentary institutions, and in places like Botswana, they worked really well, and in places like South Africa or Sri Lanka, they did not. And in Papua New Guinea, so I was in Papua New Guinea during a pivotal moment in its history called the Sandline Affair, where there's a government coup and the prime minister is overthrown and he's replaced by a well-known gang leader. And New Guinea is one of the most linguistically, or if not the most linguistically diverse place on earth. It is truly tribal politics meets, Western style institutions. And there's just no way the thing works. There's just no way. So underneath institutions were these cultural pillars. So I kind of felt like the economists had worked out a lot of the right answers from the
Yeah.
institutional perspective. What they were missing was the kind of cultural, the things that co-evolved with those institutions that made the institutions work. And that's what I wanted to figure out.
I mean, that's fair. I think the good economists focus a lot on cultural evolution. Also, right? You've got kind of one of the most influential essays in my intellectual development was Hayek. What was it? Law, Legislation, and Liberty? I think Volume 1, where he kind of traces the evolution of common law in the United Kingdom,
Yep.
where kind of it's common for economists to look at market outcomes and being like, right, like how many shoes should be produced next year? And it's like the market decides. And right, similarly, there is to a certain extent, like it's not as like exactly analogous, but like there is a market in kind of culture and in decision making and norms where these are the result of human action but not human design, and they co-evolve over kind of years, decades, centuries that lead to certain outcomes today. I mean, one of the like going around Twitter the last like week or so, there's been this like map of Europe, castles in Europe. All right, Germany has a lot of castles. France has a lot of castles. Do you know where there are not a lot of castles? The United Kingdom. Why? Because castles are like a late medieval technology, and the United Kingdom was a relatively centralized state in kind of the late medieval era. So because it was relatively centralized, like castles are military technology, and you don't need to build a military technology when you already have like a mostly functional centralized state. And so there are these, I don't know, good economists do try to pay attention to that, but most economists probably do not pay much attention as they should.
Yeah, no, totally agree. And honestly, if I'd read Hayek a bit earlier in my career, I think maybe I would have, tried to pursue that as a path. And actually, I think things have changed a lot. So, much more recently, you've got, real attempts to grapple with culture coming out of Daron Acemoglu, Jim Robinson, like real attempts to grapple with this stuff. So I think what we have here is a situation where economics has a very robust and excellent framework for, let's say, institutions and maybe even individual decision making. And cultural evolution has a really powerful and rigorous framework for cultural evolution. And so it is all like, it's these old ideas of a marketplace is really an evolutionary system, and firms are living and dying and on the basis of this. And they're a great example, actually, of cultural group selection. But I think that it's the marriage of these two fields where the future lies. And I think that is really the focus of a lot of both my academic and applied work.
Yeah. And so, okay, you meet Joe Heinrich and right, kind of get really excited. How do I answer these questions? You do your PhD at UBC, focusing on psychology, and kind of like, I guess that's the big question, is kind of cultural evolution. But like, one of the things that I've kind of observed from afar, is right. One, cultural evolution is like a mostly new field, and then two, especially like less cultural evolution, but like related, is there are new measurement technologies that kind of, especially with DNA sequencing, that allow for a lot more information than was previously possible. That allows for kind of much more rigorous science and conclusions. So, like, how did your research agenda evolve?
Yeah, so I mean, the first thing to say is like I'm not kind of I joke that I'm an undisciplined scholar, or non-disciplinary in the sense that I've got questions and I don't care where they come from. If they come from genetics, that's great. If they come from economics, that's fine too. And my dissertation was actually, so the first chapter was on brain evolution, and so I had to have a biologist on the team, Christoph Howard. Another chapter was on corruption, so I had to have an economist on there, Patrick Francois, and and then I had a chapter on social learning, which was the psychology. So it was always this kind of interdisciplinary thing, just trying to fill the gaps. Yeah. So not only has economics moved on and cultural evolution kind of moved on, but the genetics have moved on, and they're all, when you kind of arrive at the truth, everything starts to point in a similar direction, let's say. And so I think we're starting to see that. So we just had a paper I wrote with Abdului was the lead author, on the way that genes and culture become intertwined in social status. And now, because we have better methods of measuring genes, we're fairly certain that's part of what's going on. Like, yes, social status is a social thing by definition, but if you have assortative mating, where people who are very smart start marrying other people who are very smart, you can stretch the tails of those distributions. I'm not sure where the question was going, other than to say, yeah, that we have new methods also in culture, right? So some of my work has been on how to quantify culture in a more rigorous way, actually borrowing methods from genetics.
The question I'm trying to, I guess, tease at is, I do think science, right, like one of the typically causes major advancements in paradigm shifts is often new technology. Sometimes it's new theories, but it's new technology that allows you, right, like you don't get the Galileo without the telescope. And similarly, right, like I don't know to what extent cultural evolution is being influenced by, like, the new technology that comes to mind is basically cheap genome sequencing. And I don't know, there's some overlap there. I don't know how much, but I don't know. We can tease that out, but there's also lots of other questions to get to.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, Mark, the field was founded by Rob Boyd and Pete Richardson, ecologist and anthropologist, respectively, and physicist originally, but also by Mark Feldman and Luigi Cavelli-Schwarzer, right, who were population geneticists. So those models have always been genetic models, and the FST measure, for example, developed by cultural evolution people, really, but applied to genes, and now applied to culture. But I do think, like, maybe this is what you're getting at. On the one hand, some of these advances have been amazing. So ancient DNA is a good example of this, right? So the story, our understanding of human evolution, which of course is the primary interest that dual inheritance theory and cultural evolution has shifted because of our understanding of the way that, we thought we just beat out the Neanderthals. We actually, we met them, we fought with them, but we also mated with them. Right. So if you're from Eurasia, you have you have a reasonable amount of Neanderthal or Denisovan or other ancient DNA. If you're from West Africa, there's a ghost population, let's call it, of another ancient hominin population. So there are these admixtures that are part of the story. But then another part of the story is like history, right? So from a cultural evolutionary perspective, history is the cultural fossil record. And so better measurements of history and better quantification, and even just putting the data together. So one of my projects, maybe you're aware of, is the database of religious history, which will expand into the database of cultural history. And it's really just it's it's a way to quantify history in a way that maps onto cultural evolution, and that we're measuring traits over time, and that allows you to then look for, what might lead to the emergence of large scale civilization, and what might lead to its collapse, and which parts of these are ecological or economic or driven by these kind of path dependencies that the culture has just gone down. The other so you're absolutely right, by the way, about technology. I think the big technology for cultural evolution specifically is AI. So for the first time, cultural evolution and behavioral science and psychology have a simulator, a human simulator. And simulation is critical to, to every good science and its ability to move and make advances, right? Like, one analogy I use is, like, everybody points to 1903 when the Wright brothers invented the airplane as the beginning of the aviation industry. Actually, the big bottleneck was training pilots. And it was 1930 when we invented a flight simulator that we removed that bottleneck, and everything really took off. Like, I mean, the cost of training pilots for bombers went from $600 an hour, and I think in their money, to $1 an hour. So now, so one of my big directions right now is building out technology to simulate, given current costs, we can simulate it kind of everything we understand about cultural evolution, everything we understand about the software. We can simulate individuals and types of people and how they would react to certain stimuli. But the goal is that eventually, as the prices drop, we'd be able to simulate populations and societies.
That's interesting. I would also think that with AI, the other kind of advantage is just, I guess, twofold. One, the ability to translate a lot more works, right? Like, I think my understanding is there's like a bottleneck. I don't know, 90% of like ancient Sumerian like manuscripts haven't been translated just because there's like a limited number of translators. Not fully sure of that, but I heard that somewhere and it seems plausible. And right, like with AI, you can basically translate everything. Two is you can now uncover additional manuscripts. There was the well-publicized example of the scrolls in, what's the city, Vesuvius?
The burned scrolls where they kind of
the burned Roman scrolls that they can now uncover, which obviously AI had a part to do. And then two is, right, like now the cost of basically analyzing textual change over long periods of time is a lot cheaper. Where previously, if it's like we've got, I don't know, 500 years of record from ancient society, and we want to look at how they refer to religious gods, or how they refer to like pronouns, or how they refer to priests, and you can basically run these like very large things, which previously might have been like a multi-year, even like multi-decade, with like dozens of people and like thousands of man-hour input, now can kind of be done with one person, with like talking to AI for a year, and then you can get like really good textual analysis of, right, like previously they would refer to all of these minor deities and that had like direct relationship with the land, and over 1,000 years, right, they began to refer to these like broader impersonal deities that would punish deviation from social norms. And we saw as that happened, right, the social structure we also know from archaeological records got more complex, and now you're kind of really tracing like, I don't know what to call it, like ideology, like worldview with social composition in a way that people are like poking at, but you get like a much stronger sense of like actual outcomes.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, so that's actually the purpose of the database of religious history. Specifically, we do other things with it, but it was to test this big gods or supernatural, like the role of religion in the rise of civilization, is kind of transitioning us from a reputation-based system to a proto-institutional-based system. And, I don't know if funders listen to this call, but we are trying to use AI to document history. And, if someone at, I don't know, Google or OpenAI or Anthropic want to throw some credits our way, we'd appreciate it. Basically to automate this whole filling process, because right now we have like 600 or so historians who are filling this thing in. We want to use AI to just take everything. So that marriage,
and so I think. What are the specific inputs that you're doing? Are you just taking like old like documents and you've got like a database? Like, what are the columns of the database? Right? Like, what is the actual like inputs that you're doing?
So the data comes from the heads of historians, from actual texts, from ancient texts, from archaeological sites, so places as well. And we have different poles within this, but because of what we focused on to begin with, we're looking at what people believed about the supernatural monitor, what they were concerned about, how they interacted with other groups, what were their social structures, how strong was their state, what did their state concern itself with, how did they engage in warfare, what kind of weapons do they have, a whole host of questions around polity, civics.
Why are you calling this the religious database? This
Oh, because
feels
our
more
original
like
funding was from Templeton.
okay. I was gonna
Got
say
no-
it feels more like I don't know Polis database, right? Like
yeah,
it's
yeah, yeah.
Polis
That's what
in
that's
the
what I
Greek
said. Yeah.
sense.
So it started in 2012, and we registered the domain name Database of Religious History and Database of Cultural History at the same time, because the idea was that yes, we've got this initial funding to start with. Religion is a little bit more circumscribed than all of
Sure,
culture, but we
sure.
want to ultimately expand. Yeah. So the technology is not designed just for religion. It's just that's where we started.
And what, right? If you've been doing this for 12 years, like what, like novel outputs or perhaps like confirming outputs have you seen from this so far?
Yeah, so we are able to show that there is this relationship, like we can confirm the relationship between social complexity and the scope and interests of gods go up, right? So the hypothesis is so the way the way this hypothesis works for listeners not familiar is if you look since 2001, we often think about religion as this really divisive thing in the world. And it's true, but before it was divisive, it brought people together, right? So Islam, the major world religions, were super ethnic groups that brought the tribes of Arabia together, the tribes of Europe together, and so on. But it's not all religions that did that. There's all kinds of little small religions that just don't care. Like they care about don't desecrate the water, don't cut down the trees. That's the scope of these gods. But the gods go up because they're kind of, in my view, like the source code. Like even though we've kind of
When you
kicked
say,
off
what do you mean gods go up?
so that the size so the belief about what God cares about and how much God knows increases over time, and it seems to be a way to stabilize things. So here's an example, right? So you might have, in the same way that you could have you have an ethnic identity. Let's say you meet another woman wearing a hijab or something. You don't know who she is, she doesn't know you, so you can't do reciprocal altruism, you can't do reputation. But if you believe that she believes you should be good to co-ethnics, and she believes that and she also believes that this ethnic identifier, in this case the hijab, it could be a cross or whatever, is monitored by the group, you can then infer with some higher non-zero probability that she might be slightly more trustworthy. So in the absence of like a centralized state, this can help you transition to that more centralized state which has these rules.
It's
Oh,
a meme to coordinate violence, or maybe not. Maybe violence is a little bit too specific, but it's a meme to coordinate like I don't know trustworthiness, action, right? Like over a large area in the absence of a centralizing state, or
exactly.
sometimes.
Exactly. And so when you get the centralized, so that's what, so there's a couple of interesting things here. One is that the traits are under selection, right? So it's not an accident that most major world religions say, be there for your family and maybe have large families and be good to other people. Like those are the traits that help a group grow at the expense of religions that don't have that. I mean, a good example of this is my favorite example actually is, people probably know some Quakers. They, mate and reproduce at a rate similar to the rest of the population. You probably don't know
Higher than the rest
Shakers.
of the population.
Maybe slightly higher, but like what I'm saying is they're not like Mormons or something,
Yeah.
right? But there's an offshoot of the Quakers called the Shakers.
Yeah.
Do you know any Shakers, Mark?
No, they all died out because they
They all
had
died out.
prohibitions against sex and reproduction.
Exactly. So, it wasn't celibacy for the priestly class, it was celibacy for everyone.
Yeah.
Not a good strategy for growing your group. So over time you get this filtering process, right? But what's interesting is then even after, so what I mean when I say it's like the source code of the civilization,
Huh.
even after you get this centralized state and the need for a supernatural god starts to disappear, you still maintain a lot of those beliefs, right? Like monogamy spreads on the back of Christianity, really.
Isn't this kind of implicitly right? Like, doesn't Christianity isn't like a little bit contrary because Christianity evolved in the Roman Empire right kind of in the era after the most of the civil wars when it had kind of early stages of a republic. But it was a large centralized state that was like fairly effective at controlling violence, especially for its time. And like Christianity basically emerged and grew in that the shadow of that centralized state, which implies that like there wasn't that like, I don't know, that there wasn't that need for coordination that might have been required if there was not a centralized state.
Yeah, so in general, religion serves this purpose, but I think what made Christianity such a successful religion is so the first mutation, with Judaism was the messianic proselytizing mutation, right? So it's like even if you go back further, the first mutation is to say normally different people believe in different gods, and we're going to find out whose god is better on the battlefield.
Yeah.
Then you've got this mutation that says objectively there is but one god. You got the 7 day story to show the Babylonians that their god, the moon and the sun and all that, were created by the one actual god, and these were just like objects in the sky. So that's the first mutation. Then the second mutation is like it becomes proselytizing, and it becomes messianic, and there's a desire to go convert and change the world. I think that what ends up happening is that gets supercharged when it gets the levers of the state. So it's able to kind of supercharge, and what's left of the Roman Empire is, I guess, the Roman Catholic Church. And so it begins to spread. It begins to outcompete on the back of this these smaller tribes. So it's kind of a supercharged version, I guess, of the broader story. And actually, as one thing I've often wondered is if that's the reason why there's a kind of difference between the West and China in terms of geopolitics, right? Like there in the West source code, there is this sense like you should all be like us, like you should be a liberal democracy. This is the right way to be. We want to spread our values. Whereas China, the story of China is one ethnic group, really, the Han, taking over. It's not like a centralizing religion that does this. It's just one ethnicity with its own kind of belief system. So China doesn't have this, like, over and over. They go out, they look at the world, they're like, whatever, that works for everybody else, but it doesn't work for us. Like, we are Chinese, you're everyone else, you do you, we do us. And there's a different way of kind of doing geopolitics that isn't so messianic, let's say, or proselytizing. So there are these hidden things in the civilization, I think, that really emerge on the back of religion.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, I guess sympathetic to that story, but like, how does it interact with, I mean, China, for example, right? Like, China's frequently referred to as Confucian, and that's not like a religion in the sense that we think of like Christianity or like Islam as religions. You have a lot, other parts of Southeast Asia are heavily Buddhist, again, which is like perhaps more religious than Confucianism, but is like not the same vector as like Christianity. So how do you think about like, if the theory is, right, to effectively coordinate over like large groups, especially in the absence of central states, right? We need kind of distant, all-knowing, all-powerful gods that kind of bind us together, right? Like, how does that relate to kind of non-Western religions that have become so influential?
Yeah. So I think you're right about Confucianism. And like I said, I think they went down a different path. Like they jump started the state, and they did it kind of through an ethno state. Whereas it's not true of Hinduism and Buddhism. So the karmic religions do have a supernatural monitor, but it's not their gods, it's karma. So it's that, you do bad stuff happens to you. You do good stuff, and it's impersonal, and it's just going to happen. That is the key mutation in that serves the same purpose as an all-seeing God. You just have an all-seeing force. Yeah.
Makes sense. Maybe to switch gears a little bit, why did humans take so long to develop civilization? Right. So typical story is like you get modern humans 200,000 years ago or so, and you really only get the first instances of civilization, well, like 8,000 years ago or so. Right. And so obviously there's a lot of like inputs that need to happen, namely kind of domesticated grain. But it feels like even with like kind of randomness of early humans, like it shouldn't take 200 or 190,000 years to domesticate grain. So like, what is going on that caused that, like, I don't know, slow evolutionary development up, or like cultural evolution development up till then? Or is that even the right framing?
Yeah, so what Joe Henrik and I have argued is that initially you get this kind of autocatalytic takeoff in brain size on the back of a few things, including bipedalism, which frees up your hands and opens up a pathway to learn language, and fire, which allows us to digest food outside our body and and use this to kind of shrink our guts and grow our brains. But then, because we've now moved over to kind of cultural software, the limit is a kind of collective brain rather than individual brains. So you need kind of large groups of individuals living together, cooperating with one another. And this doesn't really happen until we get agriculture. So agriculture is the prime mover here. Now you could say, why did it take us so long to get to agriculture? Different stories around that. Maybe carbon dioxide was a little bit higher. It seemed the basic story seems to be that we were dropping stuff as we were going, and we were there for long enough that we realized this was a way to start growing this. But it happened all around the world in different places. So I do think there might be kind of a broader ecological story behind it. But in any case, once you get this is my interest in cities, by the way, Mark, because once you get agriculture, you get this surplus of people. You start to get large amounts of people, and even though agriculturalists seem to be a little bit less healthy than the hunter gatherers around them, they push the hunter gatherers to the margins, which are not suitable for agriculture. So deep in the forests, into the deserts, where they still live, actually. And from agriculture, you can start to get cities, and cities are supercharged. Like if we're talking about cultural software, this is how it gets written. New ideas are flowing in and out with new people bringing things. People are learning things from one another. And it's just sheer more experiments going on. If you think about like a wisdom of the crowd something, there's just more people doing more stuff. And as long as they're learning from one another, you're going to supercharge the whole thing. So that's the first kind of supercharging that happens, and we go along, and until we, in my book, I'd basically say at first it's like a positive sum reality, like all of these ideas, it's amazing until agriculturalists hit their carrying capacity, so the amount that the agriculture can support, and then the only choice is to start fighting with other agriculturalists, and so we're back in this kind of Malthusian world right up until the Industrial Revolution, and that is the next major shift.
Yeah, well, let's get into that. But I guess two kind of questions before jumping into that. Like, one is, what about Tepe Gobleke? Because the
Yeah.
right standard human story is right humans discover agriculture, then you actually get like agglomerations, dense enough people, then you get basic civilization. But like Tepe Gobleke, right, is dated pre kind of agriculture. So there at least appears to be some fairly strong evidence that people were getting together in bands of like thousands, if not tens of thousands of people to do relatively complex works of putting big stones around. And that implies that there is like maybe some like, I don't know, civilizational impulse in humans that is like pre-agricultural. That is kind of, I don't know, a very interesting element to think about with like this broader kind of like cultural evolution dynamic.
Yeah, so we don't know what's going on with Göbekli Tepe, but it. So I think again we're speculating because we just don't know what was going on there. There's different ways people can come together. It could have been like bands of kin, right? So you just have like common groups of lineages, like the 12 tribes of Israel type thing, where people come together and do these things. In some of our experiments, what we show is that the problem is if you don't have this reliable flow of information between large groups of people, things can pop up and then they disappear. So you can invent things, but they don't spread anywhere, so they just kind of disappear. You need the full network, you need the full ecosystem for something to take place. So it could be like that. So in our experiments, again, these are stylized, but in our games and things, people will invent or discover the right solution, but it doesn't get spread unless sociality is high, unless the population size is high enough and the interconnectivity is high enough. You get these genius Einsteins, but they come up with something, it serves their purposes, and then it disappears. And Göbekli Tepe could be a little bit like all of the kind of lost technologies over time. Like someone comes up with something by accident, serendipity, by some crazy recombination, just because they're just brilliant, whatever, but it doesn't lead to civilization, which is a collective process. So that's why I think it took agriculture in cities to make that happen.
The other kind of point before getting into Industrial Revolution is just regards to, like, it's kind of going back to James C. Scott, right? His argument, you mentioned that, okay, until kind of or pre-modern states, early modern states hit carrying capacity, it was like, okay. And then once they kind of hit their size, it became, all right, they kind of started fighting with each other. They were trapped in a Malthusian dynamic. At least James C. Scott argues, in my opinion, fairly convincingly, is that like one kind of, you already mentioned, right? Like individual lifestyles were probably inferior in kind of agricultural river valleys to hunter gathering. It was just that there were a lot more of them. And then two, there appears to be at least decent evidence that a lot of the population would literally just be enslaved from like hill tribes, right? They would basically, the pre-modern states needed people to work in the rice fields or whatever. And they, I don't know if they, right, like the birth rates were too low or just too many people escaped. They would like go up to find populations of people in the nearby hills and like enslave them, force them back and say, all right, you have to work in the kind of rice fields till you die. So it wasn't like even kind of before they kind of hit carrying capacity and started fighting with other states, it wasn't exactly pretty.
Yeah, so within states, I mean, with the advent of agriculture, we also see a lot more inequality, right? And we start to see inherited wealth classes. So once you get property rights and you get surplus and you're able to store that surplus, then you start to see a very, very big shift. Like most hunter-gatherer groups, unless they have a lot of resources, tend to be fairly egalitarian. And we think it's just because they live in a zero-sum environment where there isn't strong property rights. There's no ability to keep this stuff for yourself. So that's just, in my view, that's not really a puzzle. It's just kind of an extension of that. Is that the lowest group that you can get is the person who's not even in your group. And if you're acquiring wealth and you're doing it better than the groups around you, you may as well get them in to keep you acquiring wealth. The inequality begets the slavery.
So, okay, basically, I don't know, 200,000 years ago, humans start, or maybe longer than that, right? Walking on 2 feet. 200,000 years ago, we get fire. Fire allows us to grow our brains and shrink our guts.
Fire, but yeah.
2 million years ago. I mean, there was some other, I don't know what the kind of, whatever, right? Then we get agriculture 10,000 years ago or so, right? We're in.
So 6,000 years ago, let's say cities, yeah.
Yeah, 6,000 years ago, cities, and then Industrial Revolution 200-ish years ago, right? Like, what were the requirements to get there? How did that, like, impact everything?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look, as I point out in my book, if you look at just about any measure of progress, size of states, lifespan, infant mortality rates, whatever you want, energy capacity, war making capacity, it does go up, but it's kind of bobbing along until the Industrial Revolution, where it just like hockey sticks up. So what I argue in my book is a lot of those are like efficiency gains. So we didn't have the kind of new energy form. So actually fire and agriculture they were energy technologies, right? They really enabled us to command and control far more energy. And that is what really powers all of civilization. So when you don't have that, or even when you do have that, what you're really doing is just gaining efficiency in things. So when you're fighting with one another, there's all kinds of battles over better bows and arrows and better swords and better ways of aggregating and better ways of cooperating too, so that you can get armies, and you get the armies to march, and you get the armies to work together, and you find ways to make sure that there are no defectors, you decimate groups and whatever. So that's what's bubbling along. And later on, before you get to the Industrial Revolution, we of course have things like the Enlightenment. We have things like the Scientific Revolution, which is all laying the foundations. So it's laying the foundations, I think, in the technology that was going to be required. It's laying the foundations with, therefore, the efficiency with which we can use power. But there's also some interesting shifts in our ability to cooperate with one another. So a lot of my work has been on like how we reach these higher scales of cooperation. And one part of that story is you need something to cooperate toward. So when you access a reward, the per unit payoff for that reward has to be higher than what you would get if you were in a smaller group. That's the only reason you'd be working in a large. So if the market isn't large enough, there's no reason to start a big company. You would make more money in a smaller company. If you can't outcompete this other civilization with lots of gold in a large group, you just do this thing in a small group initially. But the other half of this is that you have to have like efficiencies by which you kind of get there. So you have to develop these new technologies, and you have to be able to work together. You have to be able to cooperate. So have something to fight toward, but also suppress lower scales of cooperation that tend to undermine higher scales. One example of this is, so Joe Henrich and Jonathan Schultz and a few others have argued that in Europe, one key shift was the destruction of European tribes. So the Catholic Church ends up banning cousin marriage, which removes European tribes. Like, where do the European tribes grow? Like, I live in the UK right now. We had the Angles and the Saxons and the Picts and the Vikings, and they're all gone. And what happened was they married among one another. Normally, groups don't do that. Groups tend to marry their cousins. They tend to marry their relatives. And so you get effectively tribes. You get ethno-tribes that undermine states. Your uncle isn't just your uncle. He's related to you by all these means. And the traditional family is not traditional at all. Normally, we have a traditional family web, not a family tree. So by doing this, we kind of bring us back down to more individualism, and we set the stage for a higher scale of cooperation, which we don't see emerging in let's say, the Middle East or many parts of Africa. So that's the second half of this. All of this is kind of laying the foundation so that when we discover the cheap and accessible coal in Britain, we have the technology to work it. We have the cooperative structures to do it. Guilds, right? Another example of this is guilds. There's a famous paper about the McGravy traders. Do you know this work maybe? Yeah, so the McGravy traders, right? So this is a major cooperative shift. Like prior to that, you could only trust your relatives. And so the extent to which you could grow was the family corporation. You had to have many sons. You had to send them out. But the Maghreb traders found a way to access reputation, and they shared reputational information, and this allowed them to kind of scale upward. Eventually, this leads to what we take for granted these days, but corporations that are not based on family, where you can bring your labor based on your own ability, which is incredibly empowering for both cultural evolution and cultural group selection, and is exactly what you need to alongside the energy and alongside the efficiency to supercharge this whole thing. And then we have the era of colonialization, right? So we have the great divergence where Europe takes off and everyone else is kind of stuck where they are. Colonialization leads to these highly cooperative, energy powered, technologically efficient groups going and taking this stuff from everyone else, until a few of those other groups figure out ways to take that same technology, remix it, and make it their own in the way that South Korea and Japan and Singapore and others did, and more recently China. So that's the kind of cultural evolutionary story of history, if you like.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm quite sympathetic to it. I mean, one of the other points on, I guess, like sometimes suppressing smaller forms of coordination is like you often see this debate kind of about like decentralization versus centralization, which to me is kind of like missing the point. Like some things are better centralized, some things are better decentralized. The question is like, what is the optimal unit of governance for different decisions? And so kind of one of the classic examples in Europe is like modern states. Basically, one of the key things they did was smash local principalities to allow for free trade, right? So if you travel down the Rhine pre-Germany, you'd have to pay a new tax every like mile or 2 miles, and that tax incidence end up being extremely high, basically making interior trade to Germany functionally impossible, except for extremely high value goods, right? And by creating internal free trade zones, that created the ability. It was centralization, right? It was smashing local authorities, but those local authorities were net negative for cooperation, at least on certain margins. I mean, one of the kind of questions, I guess, like
So, Mark, if I might just kind of jump in there, like real quick. So, what you're describing is what I call the kind of law of cooperation, because it applies everywhere. So, take corruption, right? Those like little princedom taxes that prevent any kind of growth are the same as the kind of corruption that goes on in, let's say many parts of Africa, where each person, in order to make a business, has to pay this person, pay this person. By the time you get there, there's not much. The black tax, right, is sometimes what it's, or the kinship tax is what it's sometimes called. But so if you look, a lot of places around the world, you see a lot of nepotism because you didn't smash the tribes, you didn't ban cousin marriage. In Europe, you don't see nepotism, you see kind of more cronyism, and you see these kind of higher state princedom stuff, which still needs to be smashed, or at least aligned. So, even going back to kind of evolutionary biology, and this is what I mean, it's like it's a law that applies all the way even down to bacteria and cells. You yourself are an ecosystem, right? And when you have misalignment, that's a cancer. That's like disease. Because every cell is incentivized to make sure you're okay, that's why the system works. And the same thing is true of a state. Like it's fine to devolve power as long as there's alignment between the interests of those devolved units and the higher level state.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the kind of most interesting things. There's, I forget his name, Banfield, right? His kind of classic study of Italy, where northern Italy is kind of basically Germanic. Southern Italy is arguably like a little bit more Arab, especially kind of 100 years ago, where he looked, and in northern Italy, Germanic in the sense that they had this ideal, right, like kind of a Germanic conception of good, of like public propriety. Well, in the southern area, I think the term he used was amoral familialism, which is basically like, look, like morality only applies to your family. You can't steal from your family. You can't attack your family, but it does not apply outside of your family. So, right, like there is social sanction to go and steal, to do violence upon, to harm anyone outside the family. Perhaps not surprisingly, most of the mafia, for example, came from southern Italy that had those norms, which have been kind of historic norms throughout most of history. In Somalia recently, for example, or maybe not recently, but there's my understanding of a kind of Somali saying is, right, me against my brother, me and my brother against my cousin, me and my cousin against the world. Where, right, like if you get in a fight with your cousin, your brother is expected to come to your side. If you get in a fight with somebody like more distance than your cousin, then your cousin expected to defend you. And this serves as the violence containment mechanism because you and your kind of clan have a credible threat of violence if you are wronged. So therefore, if you are wronged, stolen from, assaulted, whatever, right, you and your clan come to defend you and demand payment for that violence. And if not, there's a credible threat that they can commit a kind of proportional violence against the initial aggressor. And that's what maintains the equilibrium instead of a kind of third-party state that serves as the enforcer of violence.
Yeah, exactly. And you see this in so many different places, right? So Latin America, descendants of Southern Europe, La Familia Tuto, higher in nepotism, higher in corruption more generally. There's this Franz Chapinot has this data where he asks people, you're driving along, with your brother, your relative, whatever, they crash into somebody and kill them. Does this relative have the expectation that you would lie to them in court? Or maybe it's your friend. Does this have the expectation that you would lie to them? Would you do it for them? Northern Europeans are absolutely not. Of course I wouldn't do that, right? They're worse friends. They're worse family members. Whereas, in Latin America, Africa, even parts of Southern Europe, they'll be like, of course I would. Even in terms of like jobs. So, there's data on like how you found a job. And in parts of just, the data's from Europe. In Southern Europe, you're more likely to find it through a contact. In Northern Europe, you're more likely to find it through a job ad. So, basically all of these things, in the same way that the princedoms were extracting taxes and making the system more inefficient, these same things are making these places less efficient, less, growth filled, and undermining meritocracies. But it's a much more general principle, and this is why I think I'm so interested in cultural evolution, because you're able to extract these things and apply them elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, you also have Fukuyama. He wrote a book, I think it was called Trust, where he looked at basically corporate organization. And I think he compared the US and China. Maybe there are other examples, but those are what kind of stuck out in my mind, where kind of China had very different, like in the US, for example, you would typically have like an executive and the CEO will have, I don't know, between 8 and 12 direct reports, but you usually don't have above 12 direct reports. And then you've got kind of a hierarchy where each person has between 8 and 12 people below them until the organization works, right? And in China, the number of direct reports to the CEO would just be like an order of magnitude higher, like sometimes 150 people. And why? In part because there was not that same degree of kind of interpersonal trust, where the CEO then felt that they needed to oversee everyone individually to the greatest extent of their ability, because they were kind of that lack of social trust precluded them from being able to delegate some of their authority to third parties, which obviously has a big impact on economic efficiency and other elements.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, so in my book, Mark, I make fun of the kind of books that are the one thing that explains everything. Everybody's got their like one piece of the puzzle, and they're like, this is the key mover. In reality, you needed a whole bunch of things to come together to lead to this great divergence and industrialization and this takeoff. And where just about any of those pieces are missing in these other places, we see exactly this kind of breakdown, right? So it could be you didn't smash the kins, or you didn't, these tribes, you didn't incentivize, and so they get stuck in these suboptimal political kludges where, yes, actually the resources are there. They could be a very wealthy country, but they're unable to trust one another. They're unable to cooperate with one another, and as a result of that, human capital is low. They haven't received the education that they should. A small group of elites is cooperating with a large multinational corporation, with aid, with a country directly, and cooperating to the degree that they're undermining, like they're selling off their resources, making themselves wealthy at the expense of the rest of the population.
And
same thing.
I guess why did this happen? Why did the Industrial Revolution happen in Europe, and more specifically in the United Kingdom? Because, right, like if you look at agriculture, right, agriculture developed independently in like 7 different places. And the Industrial Revolution, right, I've seen cases made for like, all right, why not the Roman Empire? Or why not China? I think particularly the kind of Ming Dynasty that had decades, if not like 100 plus years of like sustained economic growth and innovation in terms of gunpowder, in terms of like printing. So what were those places missing, right? Like, was there like, I don't know, some degree of randomness if we simulate all of human history again? Is it like, I don't know, Britain 5 times out of 10, France 3 times, like China 2 times out of 10? Like how do you think about the kind of arbitrariness and variance in these outcomes?
Yeah, so I don't think about it deterministically. I do think about it as kind of probabilistically. And so a lot of the pieces were there. Like, so why not the Roman Empire? unclear, but one answer might be you didn't have all the prerequisite technology and slavery was pretty cheap. So even if you did get these, these mechanized devices, they were not cheaper than having slaves. You didn't yet have this kind of breakdown of the kin relation, so you had more individualism and more assortment of talent with the rise of the cities, with the rise of the guilds, with the rise of, which then didn't allow for things like in these other places, didn't allow for things like these larger collective brains, people meeting in coffee shops and swapping ideas and debating the pamphlets of their age, right? In the same way that we do that on social media. They didn't have all those pieces, and so the technology wasn't rapidly able to change and able to adapt to the changing circumstances in quite the same way. You've got all those pieces in place in a variety of places in Europe, and I think there were some candidate sites for industrialization. Parts of Germany where the cheap and available coal, I think, was a big thing. So not only did you have all of these pieces, you had the guilds, you had the cooperative societies, you had the prerequisite technology, you had the Enlightenment, but then you also had energy, and you had energy that was easy to access. So that's why I think you had a higher probability of this thing taking off in Britain. If you reran it, there might have been parts of Germany, there might have been parts of the Netherlands, for example, that it might have also happened.
So I think this is, I don't know, it's similar to how I think about it, but one of the, I guess, like sympathetic to the broad strokes of cultural evolution, but kind of like, I guess, how granular do you think the explanatory power is? Because like, while there is some degree of, right, like reasonable data supporting like some of the broad strokes, right? If you think about human history, like, I don't know if you're familiar with progress studies, but progress studies kind of, the question is, right, like why are some times and places far more innovative than others? And obviously, right, there's kind of ancient Greece, there's the Renaissance, there's, right, like turn of the century Venice. I mean, you could kind of, I guess, point to some of the inputs, but it feels to me that, like, I don't know, if there's like other factors going on that feel pretty difficult to explain, that like might be cultural evolution related, but not like only kind of like vaguely related. And like, I guess how much fitting do you see to some of these like kind of key turning points?
Yeah. So yeah, I love the question. It's great. First off, big fan of progress studies. In fact, funders, if you're listening in, the other thing I'm trying to do right now is create a Human Progress Institute at the LSE, and because I think cultural evolution has something to offer progress studies, and what I think it has to offer is cultural evolution is to, let's say, progress studies what evolutionary biology is to ecology. It's the rules of the system. It shows you where the levers might be. But ecology, so if you're an ecologist, you actually have to go down and you have to measure the number of, how much rainfall you had that year and the carbon pathways and how many foxes and how many squirrels and all of that stuff. But if you tried to do that and you didn't understand, Lotka Volterra predator prey systems, you didn't understand like the concept of evolution even, you'd be running blind. Now, Darwinian natural selection or modern synthesis, that math is not at a granular level, but it is the rules by which the whole thing is operating. And so it constrains the system in some way, tells you where the sense is and where the nonsense is. And so what needs to happen is the equivalent of the modern synthesis. So in the, again, for listeners who don't know, in the early 20th century, we had this problem where you had ecology and you had, kind of the biologists who were measuring a whole bunch of stuff in disagreement with these kind of evolutionary models. So the evolutionary models, you've got apparently things are genetic, and you've got pea plant experiments that suggest that there are tall genes and short genes, and yet the human height looks like a Gaussian distribution, a normal distribution. How does that work? So you have to figure out how this stuff, and there's a whole bunch of math, there's a whole bunch of people who came together, Wright, Fisher, Hamilton, and so on. Hamilton was later, but they come together and they figure it out. They say, actually, it turns out the reason that we have a continuous distribution is because of the environment, but also because things are polygenic. You have lots of additive individual effects that then replicate, if you like, a continuous distribution, even though in reality we have little genes. That's what needs to happen for progress studies, in my view. So cultural evolution provides the backdrop, the broad framing, the equivalent of evolution, and then now you're on the ground, and I think economics has a lot to say about that. History and historical contingencies and very specific path dependencies that take place have a lot to say about that. And I guess that's why, we started things like the database of religious history, because we wanted to get into the weeds and marry the science together. But there's a bit of ways to go. That's also why I'm obsessed with charter cities, right? Because it's where the rubber meets the road. It's like it's the tire meets the tarmac. We don't have a lot of good models of development. Again, from a cultural evolutionary perspective, aid sucks. Like it's not amazing from so yes, it can increase education. It can provide that, that impetus that might move a system out. But it often also does things like undermine farmers, right? Like how do you compete with free food that's coming out of America that's producing way more? Or the fact that it props up autocratic regimes who can use this to keep themselves in power, even if a little bit trickles down to the population. Whereas again, from a cultural evolution perspective, it's the competition that's really going to drive this. And if we look around the world, we see some success stories that seem, somewhat organic, like Japan to some degree. At least they wanted to bring in, they were spending tons of money on German engineers coming in to teach them how to do stuff. They were borrowing stuff about cars and whiskey and later on other things. South Korea is another example of that. But other than that, it's just like city states. Like we seem okay at governing ourselves at the level of these states. So in my view, this an ecosystem of startup cities is like is like Silicon Valley. It's the equivalent of the Hayekian, firm competition, where they're learning from one another in the same way that the coffee shops are swapping ideas, and they represent another model that could undermine these kind of autocratic, corrupt states. But again, you have to do it in this careful way that there's some alignments, the money's splashing around. It's not this tax haven or this gated community that then doesn't transform the local region. But in my view, it's like it's the best shot we have at a developed world. And to go back to the beginning of this conversation, the reason that it matters for a lot of people when I talk to people, they're like, I just don't care about what's going on in Africa, if they're being honest with me. And there's a good reason to care. And the reason is because other people's problems, insofar as you can't control your borders, are very quickly going to be your problems, right? And so, yes, should we be, enforcing things of course we should, right? But we should also be trying like the equivalent of projects that might actually develop these regions will reduce the push factor.
I think in addition to that, there's also just like having a large market is good. Having more people innovate is good, right? Like obviously there's geopolitical competition right now with China and the US, but like if China can develop a drug that saves cancer, that helps the US.
Yeah.
And if there's a lot more demand for cars or for airplanes or whatever in Africa because they're a lot wealthier, right? Like that means there's a lot more reward for developing innovations along that matter.
So just to say, like, the edge of one discipline and the beginning of another is what you consider signal and what you consider noise. And so what everything you just said, I totally agree with. I just take it for granted. It's like, why is China trying to do this, the Shenzhen Guangzhou thing all around the world? Because they know that it works. And, of course, innovation is going to be good and increasing people's welfare is going to be good for everyone. More people developing drugs and developing new technologies is great for the whole world. It's great for humanity.
So I guess several kind of related questions on cultural like evolution. I mean, there's a few, like you told the story kind of up to industrialization, but now to a certain extent we have like a global culture. It's not like fully global, but it's like largely global. Like arguably there's like two poles, like US and China. But if you look, so like Robin Hanson, for example, has written that like we've basically stopped building nuclear, right? And it wasn't just the US, right? Like it was US and almost everyone else. Or you had some exceptions, like France did it for energy independence largely in the 70s. But like his argument is basically that because we have a single global culture that is largely mimetic, it's not even like formal regulatory prohibitions. It's just like, right, kind of US is viewed as the highest status, most influential. So when South Koreans designed their nuclear program, they're like, okay, let's just kind of copy some version of America's, take our cues from them, which ends up making it prohibitive to build new nuclear energy. And right, like there is this kind of risk now that we have a single global culture that if this global culture, right, isn't facing competitive culture forces from other sides, it becomes stagnant, it drifts to the wrong path, and that leads to kind of very negative outcomes.
Yeah. So, Robin and I actually had a podcast where we forgot to hit record. We spoke for honestly about 2 hours on this very topic. So let me, so first off, I'm very sympathetic. So I do think that's part of what's going on. And you can see little indications of this, right? So under conditions of uncertainty, let's say with the universities right now, people are like, well, what's Harvard going to do? Oh, they're doing a hiring freeze. We should do it. Like, you don't go wrong following Harvard, right? So similar kind of thing. It's like the US goes down this direction. You don't go wrong following the US. The only thing that I can see fighting against that is like when things don't go so well, or you accidentally discover something else that works well for you, or you try that thing and it doesn't seem to work. So you recombine it into something that's Singapore isn't quite Harry, Lee Kuan Yew is a very British man, really, but he decided this couldn't just be a British state; it would be its own thing. So I think that's part of it, but I don't know if that's I'm big on. I think one of the biggest missteps that created many of the problems that we're facing today was the stillborn nuclear revolution, and the fact that we're restarting these on the back of AI is massive. I think that is a big part of it. But I think there were other forces as well that the oil industry, for example, there are other forces that would be incentivized to not lead to an era of cheap electricity and the electrification of just about everything.
I mean, the other kind of, I don't know, global cultural issue that strikes me as a big problem is fertility, right? And now basically you've got Africa as above replacement. Yeah, go for
Sorry,
it.
I just wanted to add one more thing. So another place you see this is in the contrast between China and the United States. So I have a model that tries to explain why China has these long periods of stability, punctuated by rapid change, where everybody changes, and we show that you can recover this if the population is like highly conformist and not as and you have a slightly different social structure. So in the United States, no one person is able to kind of dominate the scene. It's a constant flow of different competing ideas. Not only is the federal state structure set up that way, but just in general, people's levels of skepticism and conformity. You do you, highly individualistic. Whereas in China, that leads to conformity and it leads to stability for a long time, unless you're in the right place, you've got the right connections, and then you puncture the whole thing. And for the very same reasons that they were stable, they then move to a different place. So you get these kind of eras, and I think that's kind of what's going on in the world as well today, where you get the more we centralize, the more we have like everybody has to agree to this set of laws, European Human Rights Court, whatever. We're all subject to this whole thing. The more that it squashes this, but there are always going to be places that want to do it, and those end up being the skunk works, the places that they're trying new policies. And again, to go back to the whole, I'm talking to CCI, right, or the Charter Cities podcast. This is why cities are so important, because it allows for the kind of policy experimentation that is very difficult to do in a highly centralized structure. So the United States gets away from this a little bit. Like, so Justice Brandeis, he refers to each state as a laboratory, and that really helps. Like here's an example. Like many people probably know this one. 19th century law means that you can't enforce non-compete agreements in California. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? You don't know. You actually don't know in advance because companies have to protect their patents, but it's good for ideas to flow around. It turns out when the tech sector came out, they figured that out, and it ended up being a really good thing because you can just grab talent and you get the patents alongside it, and you get cross patents and ways of dealing with it. So other states start to copy it, and eventually, as of I think April last year, 2024, it becomes federal law. But if you don't have that kind of experimentation, then I think let's call them Hansen effects, start to happen, and the whole population can drift toward bad things. And you're about to talk about fertility, which is of course what Robin and I spent an hour talking about. So just ask me first, and then I'll say it.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, just touching on your kind of Ostromian question, which is like, what is the optimal level of decision making for what unit? This is sort of what we're hoping to do with Zanzibar a little bit, right? Create a hub in East Africa, both with the African Urban Lab, which is a partnership with African School of Economics, where you are a director of one of the programs, I want to say.
Research lead, I don't know what the title is.
Lead.
Person who does stuff in cities, technology, and innovation.
Yeah, and then two with like Zanzalu, which is our 1 month festival. There is like, okay, right, like, and I think this is especially important as like the U.S. kind of let's call it the long arm of the U.S. global policeman kind of begins to recede, right? We will see a lot more institutional experimentation and innovation regionally, and right, like I think the U.S. Wanted to basically pound every state into a somewhat recognizable counterparty. Where they would say like, okay, we need you to like, our government people need to be able to meet your government people, and our corporations need to be able to get the right permits to invest, to limit liability. And as we see kind of the U.S. withdraw, I expect we'll see a lot more institutional diversity in these places, with kind of different institutional forms, different like kind of structures take the form. I suspect most of them are going to be worse than their previous instantiation, but hopefully some of them will be better, and we'll be able to kind of like push things a little bit along.
Yeah, no, that's right. I'm not sure if there's a question, but I agree with all of that. One of the nice things is if you're not at the technological frontier, like China for a long time was not at the technological frontier, then you can just steal, right? Like we should be doing a lot more policy theft. You can't just take something from one place and bring it to another. You have to make it your own. But that kind of learning, I think, is quite possible. I mean, one example of this was like Estonia, the Tiger Leap, their educational revolution, 1991, Soviet occupation ends, 97. They're like, we're a small country, we're not very rich, but what we do have is, people who care about education. We should just be stealing the best practices from around the world, and this technology thing seems important. So they go reading, writing, arithmetic, and algorithms as a fourth pillar. They start to teach like elementary school kids how to program. They're, programming little robots to do geography lessons. It's like, today we're on China. What do we know about China? And so on. And it leads to them being the top Western country in reading, in mathematics and science, right? And they can do that because they're not at the technological frontier. They can kind of steal and borrow. But then because of in that adaptation, they learn a bunch of stuff. They become an exemplar that other countries can then learn from. So I think a similar stories could happen in Zanzibar, and that's my hope. That's why I'm involved in it. Which is, you got the Harvard and MIT thing going. You've got IIT's very first international campus. You've got the African School of Economics. You've got Silicon Zanzibar and Zanzalu and all of the, let's bypass garments and go straight to technology. And the only piece that I see missing from this nice little pipeline is the lower education section. So elementary and high school is abysmal. You got class sizes over 100. You have, textbooks shared 3 to 4 kids. Poor teacher training. So at the moment, one of my projects is running a pilot study looking at how AI and teaching kids how to safely and effectively use AI for the purposes of learning might actually lead to a better place. This is my last call, funders. This is another one you might want to fund. Yeah. So, this would be this. I think then the circle is complete, and it has all the reasons to be like an engine of growth. But like with all startups, most startups fail, but we're doing our best here.
And so, yeah, kind of going back to the previous question on like kind of global culture, one of the, I guess, like obviously fertility is kind of crashing around the world. Like Africa is only part continent above replacement. And you've got like some in Central Asia, I think Uzbekistan, Afghanistan still above replacement. But it's obviously, right, like abysmal globally. And this isn't just a recent phenomenon, right? If you look at kind of my understanding is, for the Roman upper class, right, they were basically at or below replacement fertility for a lot of part of the Roman Republic, much of the Roman Empire, right? And this kind of what's most surprising to me is, right, kind of the standard story is female education, whereas women get more educated and more empowered, fertility rates drop, which obviously has a degree of truth. But if you look at, right, like North Korea, when I last checked, their fertility rate was reported at about 2. And again, it's North Korea, so who knows how valid those statistics are, but that it feels like it's like I would expect it, I don't know, like 5 or 6. Just because it's extremely poor. I think like 1,000 or 1,500 per capita GDP, like largely agricultural. I mean, it's communist, so I assume like female education is probably better than most like 1,500 per capita GDP places, but like the men are probably getting like, all right, you're 12 years old, go work the farms, right? And it's probably women are probably being treated similarly. And 2, it's also, right, like very culturally isolated, right? They intentionally like throw up as many firewalls as they can to minimize foreign kind of ideological influence. And like, I guess like 1, it's kind of like, I don't know, crashing fertility is a problem, and 2, it defies like this kind of, I don't know, major demographic trend kind of defies a simple explanation. I don't know if you agree, if you disagree, but like it feels like, I don't know, in some ways counter to the standard evolution point, which is like, all right, we're richer, we're more successful. Like, why aren't we propagating our genes more? So I don't know how you think about all those factors.
Yeah. No, I think a lot about this. So I have speculations about what might be going on. I don't obviously know the answer. So what I actually think is this is an example of something that's been called cultural runaway selection. So it's the equivalent of like the peacock's tail. So in genetic runaway, typically through sexual selection, the peacock, wants to have a small tail actually, but the peahen loves the sexy tail, and so the peacock ends up with as large a tail as possible, even though it's going to get captured by predators. It still has to have this in order to get laid, really, and so you end up with this suboptimal tail. I think there's an equivalent in culture. So Boyd and Richardson actually suggested this to explain like all body tattooing, where basically initially, tattoos are dangerous, in a world before antibiotics and stuff. And so you have a few, but eventually you need to fill your whole body in order to have the same signal value. I think a similar story has happened here with what we consider to be prestigious. And that prestige can then lead to runaway. So we value very heavily economic success of both sexes. And that has all kinds of implications. Like Elizabeth Warren has this book, I don't know if you've read it, called The Two Income Trap. And she talks about the fact that, same number of resources, having both. So it used to be that one person, typically the man, would go to work, and a woman would go in and out of the workforce as needed, as the family needed it. But when both people were working, and they required both incomes to buy a house and to do all these things, it put them in a very precarious situation, because if one of them lost their jobs, it threatened bankruptcy for the whole family. So it had all these other effects. But in order to compete on the marketplace, and because we value, so if it were the case, I'm rambling a little bit, but if it were the case that you said to people, I have 10 kids, and they treated that in the same way that you exited, with nine figures, we'd see a lot more people with 10 kids. But we don't. So we've kind of gone this runaway where you get more and more value from your economic output, and so people double down on whatever it takes to do that. And typically that comes at the cost of fertility, particularly among women. And if you look, a lot of surveys suggest that women's ideal number of children ends up being a lot higher than the number of children they actually have.
Yeah, and
And
like
they're
the U.S. is like 2.5, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And you're below two, or if you go to
We're at
South
like
Korea.
1.7, I think, in the U.S.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so basically, so you're pushing on this new selection pressure, which is the ability to give birth at an older age, but trading off against economic output. So how does that shift? Well, I mean, first off, if you have prestigious figures who can drive cultural change, so the fact that, for people who like Elon Musk, the fact that he's got, I actually don't know how many kids he has at the moment, but at least a dozen.
12, 13.
Somewhere around there, right? That's a pro fertility thing. It used to be religion that had some of that. So in order to have your religious standing, pro fertility was associated with that. With the die down of the few things that made that prestigious, people stopped investing in it when they had control over it.
So one kind of like changing gears a little bit, like one of the, like, at least in this conversation, my understanding is most kind of cultural evolution focuses on like group selection. It's kind of like assumed, right? Like you've got a set of groups that have some degree of random variation or innovation or whatever, and they compete, and the good ones win and expand, right? But if you look at the modern world, what feels much more relevant than group selection is, I don't know, what it might be described as group interaction. Like there's probably a more technical
Yeah.
term for it, right? Where if you look at, like, this happens in several ways. One is just immigration, right? Like the U.S. obviously has had waves of immigrants that are shaped by the U.S., but also help shape the U.S. Like kind of the good old symbol of like Americana, right? Like hot dogs, white picket fence, nice manicured lawn is like a much more German symbol than like English symbol, right? And like Germans were obviously not the founding ethnic group of America. They came in largely in like the 19th and early 20th century.
Yeah.
And similarly, right, where America has a great deal of Hispanic innovation today, and that's
Yeah.
probably going to shape what America looks like in 50 years. You've got like the United Kingdom.
Mhm.
I think 6% of the United Kingdom's population now is Muslim, which is probably like, right, Central South Asian plus like maybe Middle Eastern. That's beginning to shape Europe. And so like I don't know, like if this has like formally been modeled in some of your or your colleagues' research, but like how do you think about not just the, like, I don't know, right, like I don't know, how does
Yeah.
the this kind of feature?
Yeah. So first off, so cultural group selection doesn't actually. So one of the common misconceptions is it's actually not selection between groups. Like it's not a cultural form of group selection. It's selection on cultural groups. And by cultural groups, they're actually groups of traits, not groups of people. So the thing is that people can switch traits and thereby, change their group affiliation. And the four best studied ways that cultural groups compete with one another is, the first is kind of direct competition. So that's the one I think you have in your head, which is firms, born, they have particular traits that help them grow in the market or not, and they go bankrupt, or they get merged and acquired by other firms. So yeah, so there's direct competition. There is migration. The other one is demographic growth. So there are things that just allow the group to organically grow. This is most often the case with things like religion, right? So the religions that were pro fertility, like the Mormons, they went from like obscure cult to, oh, we have a presidential candidate who's Mormon, on the back of polygamy and large families and emphasis on family, right? So that's an example of kind of demographic transition. And the final one is prestige bias cultural group selection, which is where a group just acquires the traits of another group and thereby becoming part of that group, even though it's not through migration, it's not the people have changed, they've just taken on the traits. So the spread of democracy, for example, is a good example of that, where for a long time, autocrats would pretend to have elections. Why do they do that? Because we all agreed that democracy was the way we should be governing ourselves. When I teach this in class, I put up a photo from Japan where you've got like Japanese hip hop artists, and they're dressed like African Americans. There's no reason they need to dress like African Americans, but that's part of the import of hip hop culture into Japan. It was entirely this kind of prestige bias cultural group selection. So I think that, I mean, those are probably not the only mechanisms. There's other things like overlapping groups. The fact that people belong to multiple groups and thereby they've formed bridges for cultural transmission to occur. Leaders, for example, are formed groups of leaders, and they can be quite influential in their separate groups. But I think for 80% of the phenomena I've seen, this does a decent job of explaining what's going on at the level of Darwinian evolution. You then have to get into the weeds, as I said earlier, about ecology.
And I mean, you're a professor at a university, and universities are kind of going through a, I don't know, major kind of crisis, one of the bigger ones in the last few decades. To the extent, right, like one in the U.S., they're under a lot of funding pressure because the Trump administration is kind of targeting them in part because of past, right, like DEI requirements and statements, as well as kind of what the Trump administration would probably describe as hostility towards Israel. You have that combined with the fact that universities, college age populations in the US peaked like 5-6 years ago. So there's kind of demographic decline that is threatening revenue, combined with you've got this kind of prestige threat where right now, like from kind of the Teal Fellowship, right now in Silicon Valley, for example, it's higher status to drop out of Stanford than it is to graduate from Stanford. And then you've got the question of like, is all of this research funding being used effectively? Like if science is slowing down and it's getting funded more than ever, right? Like where in this chain is breaking. So like, I don't know to what extent like you think about these things, to what extent your university life is impacted to them, and to what extent like given that universities are a key driver of cultural evolution in some ways, right? Like how your kind of research inputs into your kind of considerations of some of these things.
Yeah, I mean, lots of things to be said here. I will try to say them in some reasonable order. I mean, the first thing to say is like, I'm an issues guy, not a tribe guy. So I'm pretty centrist, and it feels to me like anyone who's in the center is ducking as the axe swings from one side to the other. You had like crazy administrative overreach on the left for a long time, and now you've got administrative overreach on the right, which is and maybe there's a correction basically going on, and I totally get where everybody's coming from. The second is there is a place for basic science research, right? Like not everything needs to be applied, and it doesn't need to be immediately applicable. I mean, we wouldn't have gotten to cryptography if we hadn't done some number theory beforehand and discovered one-way functions, right? And so when computers came out, that was the ideal, that was great. We had everything we needed to make the internet work. But at the same time, in my view, at least for a lot of my work, if it doesn't work in the real world, it actually doesn't work at all. And there's a lot of research whose value is questionable and that is not all that rigorous actually, right? So in my particular field, like I don't know what that field is, but let's say psychology for now. We had a replication crisis where 50% of studies didn't replicate, right? How many billions of dollars went into producing flashy studies and TED Talks that actually weren't true, that were not true reflections of the world, right? When it came to social psychology, it was a 25% replication rate. It was I think it was 50% actually for cognitive psychology and 36% overall. That's not great, right? That's not great. And so there's an alt-ac kind of, I should speak personally. So because I'm not wedded to being a professor and never intended to become one, I do a lot of other things. I'm a scientific advisor at an AI startup, Electric Twin, where we're replicating human behavior. I'm obviously involved in the development of new cities in Zanzibar. I also interact with what I would call alt-ac. Like, I'd consider you kind of alt-ac, and
What is alt-ac?
So alternative to academia. So you're still doing kind of
Yeah.
research, and you are, you're doing things that an academic ought to be doing, actually, like professors and researchers ought to be doing, but they're just not. They're not engaging with crypto. They're not engaging with the marketplace and the market dynamics that are going on. They're not. They're not. AI is a threat rather than something that ought to be. And the way that it's being studied is just ridiculous, actually, and so far away from what's going on in industry. Another example of alternate alt-ac would be like what's going on in a lot of companies, right? So there's research going on in firms. There always has been, like Microsoft research, Yahoo research before that. You had folks like Duncan Watts, for example, sitting in and out. So I think the academy needs to have a serious conversation. Like at the moment, the way things are going, we're going to lose a lot of things as a result of not demonstrating sufficient value and allowing a lot of very low value and arguably even harmful research, or I don't even know what to call it, scholarship, let's call it, to exist, and not pushing back on it. And the way that it interacts with the world, we're going to lose a lot, right? We're cutting NIH funding for actual drugs that are actually helpful because we were allowing for things that shouldn't have been there in the first place. What does the future look like? Sometimes, I thought if I were to try to reform a field, an agency, I'm not sure if there is a better way to do it than to kind of just cut it off and then look at what bleeds and build around what bleeds. And, maybe that's the direction that things are going in. And I think that as an academic, God, I hope this doesn't get me in trouble, but like as an academic, we need to wake up to that. Like the rest of the discipline, the rest of the academy needs to wake up to the way that we interact with the world. The ivory tower has to exist in a place where people understand, like this is tax money we're talking about, right? Like people, we're civil servants. Like the way that people act sometimes, like indirectly or directly, it's either through like student fees or or through direct taxes being used for scientific research and other kinds of research. Like we are civil servants and we ought to be able to justify our existence. And whether that is, this is basic science that will one day be useful, and that's why Terry Tao should keep doing what he's doing, or whether, this, I'm actually now working with a company and we're putting the science into action, and that's good for economic growth in this way, or we're actually out there testing it. And obviously, some academics do this better than others, and obviously, some universities do this better than others, and some people are better than this than others, and some people's work is more valued. So I'm going to say all of that. The only caveat I would say to that is that scientific research is the nature of innovation is that you are at the forefront of knowledge and you don't know what is there, like inherently, and so a high failure rate is to be expected. But that high failure rate means that you ought to be asking the world questions that is likely to lead to some reasonable answers, even if they suck. And when we have, areas of scholarship that are divorced from reality, postmodernism, divorced from how the world actually works and imposing on the rest of the world how things are, you're going to get a pushback. And I think that's what we're seeing now. And it's going to be incredibly harmful, at least in the short term.
So previously you had discussed kind of your model for China, where this
Wait, did
kind
you
of
agree with all that, or I couldn't tell?
oh yeah, I generally agree. I'm just trying
Yeah.
to I'm quite sympathetic to that point. I think academia has swung kind of too far in one direction. My understanding is basically right in the 60s there was kind of a compromise between the science parts of academia and the humanities parts. Or it's like, look, we'll let the humanities parts go hire activists, go do their thing, leave science alone. And that kind of truth worked for 60 years or so until now, when the humanities parts have started doing kind of a lot more. Then they're also starting to infringe on some of the science parts with some of their kind of restrictions and expectations, as well as starting to make demands of society at large that are probably not the place of that part of academia to make those demands. And there's a big pushback. I mean, and then two, in addition to that, right, like at least in the US, I'm less familiar with abroad, but you've got the federal government. It would not be surprising to see Trump kind of cut student aid or substantially limit student aid, right? Because Biden basically waived some student aid payments, which was functionally a handout to his political
Yeah.
supporters. So seeing Trump do something similar, not to mention the red states are likely going to start looking at substantial cuts to state schools. I suspect a lot of the brunt of that will fall in the humanities, and then you will also get a lot of collateral damage from some of the hard science programs that just fall by the wayside too. I think there is a significant question for what a university looks like in 50 years, right? What role is it providing? What services is it providing, right? Like, are the smartest kids even going to university anymore? It's kind of like before 10, 20 years ago, the highest status thing was MIT, Harvard, Stanford. Now highest status thing is like getting in or maybe not even going and starting a company.
As just a signal on your thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And right. How much prestige is there available? You see University of Austin, which has been reasonably successful, at least as creating a new kind of university model. How sustainable that is remains unclear, but they got out the gate stronger than I expected. Anyway, let me jump. I'm trying to jump to
The only thing I would say to all of that is that when the economy slows, like when growth slows, you have to make some cuts, right? And so you end up doing things that are more valuable. And when things are booming, you can do crazy things, and it's fine because you can afford to do that. So that includes everything from like high energy physics, like we need another collider, to parts of, let's say, the humanities that just don't seem immediately useful. My only concern around this is that the people doing it are painting this kind of broad brush. So I mean, like, there are aspects, like, take the database of religious history, or let's call it the database of history. It's a humanities project, but the humanities could be doing things on their own accord a lot better, right? It's a digital humanities project that emerges because engineers and economists and evolution biologists get together, and a lot of historians are actively antagonistic to the very idea of looking for patterns in history, like to the point where they just do not want to touch anything to do with that. A lot don't want to use AI to be measuring this stuff, but there was also the good side of this. Like, we do need good scholarship on the past, and like James C. Scott doesn't get to write his book unless we've got good humanities. But then there's also the crazy side of things. We can leave it there.
Yeah, I mean, it's also right. Like, I remember oftentimes when I'm reading history, I'll try to read history that was written before 1960 or like 1970. I mean, I was reading a book on Zanzibari history, and there was one like early book, it was written like 1920, which it was just like a very autistic presentation. It was like, here is Zanzibar, here are the facts, here are the people, here are where they come from, here's how they interact, here are their practices, just like listing that all out. Not like super charismatic, but like really useful for just like intake of knowledge. There's a book from like 1980. I remember it was talking about it was like, okay, the British are evil, and the Omanis who controlled Zanzibar, Zanzibar was actually the head of the Omani Sultanate for like 30 years. So it wasn't just part of the Omani Sultanate, it was the head. And then the Sultan died, and one of his sons went back to Oman, one of the sons stayed in Zanzibar. And they were talking about, right, it was basically a slave trading hub. And they were like, okay, but this wasn't as bad as the British, because if a slave owner slept with a slave, the son was considered a free person. And therefore, like, the slavery wasn't that bad. And it's just like, okay, like, is that better than them being a slave? Yeah. Like, yes. But like, is that really the framing that is like appropriate in a book about Zanzibari history? Especially when, like, literally, I think it was the shortest war in human history was the British versus, I guess it was the Omani Sultanate at the time, where the British were like, hey guys, end slavery. They were like, no. And the British fired a few cannon shells, and 30 minutes later, they were like, just kidding, we surrender. Like, literally the shortest war in human history, which was the British ending slavery, and then seeing a book kind of written from this lens of like kind of making that slavery seem not that bad was just like, okay, this is kind of a goofy framing that kind of makes it really difficult to trust the facts in the presentation of the rest of the book because of what are kind of very mismatched kind of ethics and priorities than I have. And I don't think that's a single book. That is a large, another book, this was written in the 80s as kind of a reaction to this, I think, which kind of looked at the fall of Rome. Because for a while there were people like, look, right, the fall of Rome, like, oh, it wasn't that bad. People claim it was like civilizational collapse, but in fact, these people just went to their like indigenous ways of knowing whatever. And like, I'm caricaturing.
I get what you're trying to say.
This book looked at and was like, no, look, you can look at the areas of Rome that fell and see trade patterns. Like, the pottery now came from 10 kilometers away instead of from 100 kilometers away, right? Like, it's pretty easy to actually track like economic sophistication like dropped substantially, and that led to worse standards of living for people. And yeah, that focus on, I don't know, truth underlying reality has dropped out, unfortunately, of some university departments, and that's part of the reason for the kind of swing back these days.
Yeah, no, I hear you. I mean, actually, I have a Substack on autism and how I create autism culture and norming. You should, if you haven't read it, yeah, I think you'd enjoy it. But I think that's what we're kind of one of the conflicts we're seeing in the world is around like there's enough people on the spectrum to form communities and build companies and operate, and then eventually, as the company grows, you end up with people who don't prioritize just plain speaking truth, who are just obsessed with I just want to know the answer. Like I don't like I'll decide what the implications of the answer after I know the answer. But first I want to know the answer. And and science is a kind of autistic enterprise when it's done in in that way, because it's aligned with I just want to know the truth. I'll figure out what I want to do with that after I know the truth. And there has been a breakdown of that. Like, in my neck of the woods, talking about the fact that Islam is the most culturally distant religion from the West. I've had journals try to like block that, or showing that labor force participation of more culturally distant migrants is lower, and it's not to do with female labor force participation. I've had editors just say like, you can't publish that, you can't, say things like that. Or, if you try to say even publicly that, yeah, lots of bad stuff happened, and it depends on when you're talking about the empires. But if you were going to be colonized, you were best being colonized by the Brits. People are like, you can't compare this, but I mean, if you look, that's what, the economics show, right? That they laid down better institutions that led to better outcomes for those countries relative to at least, the French and the Spanish and the Portuguese and certainly the Germans and the Belgians. But you can't, like, a lot of people like the very idea of saying that you're defending colonialism, you're defending whatever. But you can also, like, in my view, the job of the scientist is a more clear-eyed view of how the world works. And this is, where this is really going to play out, just to bring it back to the earlier stuff, is the ancient DNA stuff. There are implications of that. Go read David Reich's work that I don't think people are ready to deal with.
You have that. You have also, I think the U.S. has some public, my understanding is they've got some public, like, government-sponsored data sets of basically DNA, and they restrict access to them depending on what research questions you're asking. And so if you ask research questions that are uncomfortable, then
So
you don't get access to...
right.
Yeah, you don't get access to the files, which, right, like, look, if it's your private DNA, like, sure, if it's your private data set, like, people should be able to do what private property what they want. But, like, for the government to intermediate these disputes, right, the truth is going to come out because this technology exists,
Right.
and it just ends up making the people trying to man the walls look a little bit foolish.
Right. And the other problem, Mark, is that, like, that should be a societal discussion, not the, the purview of like a few administrators. Like, I see this all the time, right? Like, I would love to see it published. Everyone who tries to access, all of these restricted data sets and the kind of questions they're asking, just make that public. Like, I want people to know what we're saying yes and no to, and see if they agree. If they agree, fine, but if they don't, I think you're going to discover we have a real problem here, where we have gatekeepers who were never elected to be gatekeepers that are halting and holding back actually important questions that have human welfare, human flourishing, progress, and development implications.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and especially like the with new technologies coming out, namely, vast drop in cost of DNA sequencing, plus kind of a lot more research into historical DNA and migration patterns. It's possible to keep quiet when it costs, I don't know, $1 million to sequence every genome. But once it's a bit cheaper and there's a bunch of alternative mechanisms, it was only like $23 million was 23andMe before it got like delisted from the stock exchange and declared bankruptcy.
Well, all of that data is about to get bought, so let's see where that goes.
Hopefully not by the Chinese. If only we had a competent government. Anyway, so switching gears a little bit. Like, previously in this conversation, you had mentioned your kind of model for China, which was a highly conformist society that kind of explained the ups and downs, periods of stability versus periods of chaos, where, right, like, when you have high conformity, you might be a little bit more likely to kind of follow the leader and a little bit less likely to change things. And that leads to perhaps systems getting baked in for longer than they're like evolutionarily ideal. And that makes the kind of disruption process much more difficult. One, is that a fair summary of that framework?
Yeah, except a bit about, even leaders can be constrained by that process. So it's just that you can have particular leaders who with enough support that they can actually spread this kind of stuff. Like, I mean, I didn't realize this, but Mao, for example, he was kind of a social scientist. Like, he went out and he was doing these surveys out in these villages to figure out what people wanted and how to do this. And then on the back of that, he launches this revolution.
Yeah. Interesting. Mike, I had a question. Yeah. It's like, let's say you can change some of the, like, I don't know, like, let's call it underlying traits of humanity or of like a subpopulation. What traits like would you change and what outcomes would you have? So if you've got like a conformity dial, right, you dial it up or you dial it back, or maybe you've got like an agreeableness dial, a violence dial, a trust dial, like where you can imagine dialing this up and dialing it back. Like
Yeah.
how does human society differ, and how might it differ at different periods in history where, right, like, I don't know,
Yeah.
agreeableness might be very selected for now, but maybe in
Yeah.
hunter-gatherer
Yeah.
society, agreeableness was like less
Yeah.
selected for.
So there's a concept in evolution called evolvability, which is really like the mean variance trade-off. So you can be well adapted to the situation, to a particular ecology. Like, you've got beaks that fit perfectly the seeds. But the problem is, if you don't have variation where you have suboptimal beaks, if the seed size changes, your species goes extinct. So what you actually want is a lot of suboptimal behavior out there in the world, and that suboptimal behavior actually allows the system to evolve and to change. However, I think that there are some discovered cultural traits that are difficult to defend, but are essential to the evolutionary process and to progress. One example of that is free speech. Like, free speech is freaking weird. Like, the fact that it was enshrined in a constitution, that is like, Americans take this for granted. It doesn't exist pretty much anywhere in the world. Everyone claims to have free speech around the world. They don't, because they'll say except for, and then they'll list off a litany of harms through to hate speech or whatever. Blasphemy has been on the books forever. Like, you're not allowed to criticize God. You're not allowed to criticize religion. You're not allowed to criticize the leader, and that's mostly because of the rise of particularly Islam. We're getting blasphemy laws back in action in Europe, and there is no constitutional protection against it. There is no First Amendment and a Second Amendment to defend that right. But free speech is essential. If it's the free speech of the synapses of the collective brain, right? It's the connections between us. It's the only way that ideas flow. I don't have to quote like John Stuart Mill or something, but if you don't leave room for the truly vile and unconventional, you are robbing everyone's right to hear that. But also, you assume that the conventions that we currently have are the right ones, and so you have to leave room so that we can decide in the future where we're supposed to go. So if I could turn one thing up for the entire world, it would be defensive free speech. Like, in the country that I live, I would love to see that. And
Sure,
I think it would
but
be
defensive free speech is not a like it might be a human value, but it's not like a human trait.
so. What do you mean by trade? You mean like a genetic thing? Like,
Like, I don't know, agreeableness versus disagreeableness, right? People probably
well,
have like a genetic propensity to be agreeable versus disagreeable. And like maybe disagreeableness is more favorable for free speech because then you're willing to let people say things you don't agree with without
yeah,
kind of resorting to violence.
yeah. But see, personality traits are frequency dependent, right? Like, the reason we have multiple traits. So actually, like, the big five doesn't replicate in smaller scale societies. You typically get like the big two, which is like extroversion and agreeableness. Like, those two exist everywhere, but the others don't. And it seems to correlate with like socioecological complexity. So you get more bifurcation and more independence of these different traits, the more like your society allows for different types of people where your coordinates in this five-dimensional space. And like, there is, if there was like a right personality, like the one that should dominate over everything else, you wouldn't see the other personality trait actually. So I wouldn't be turning anything up. It's fine for there to be this kind of frequency dependent and an evolutionary process tuning it.
I don't know.
Both
It
culturally.
feels like right. If height is partially genetically determined, it feels like personality is partially genetically determined. Like, I mean, I don't know enough of the research to know like on exactly what axes, but like it
Yeah,
does
no.
feel like yeah.
The propensity is in the same way that the Dutch weren't all that tall until they started ingesting
Yeah.
dairy, and then they did.
Yeah.
The propensity. So even in these small scale societies, the propensity to be high in openness to new experience exists, but culture beats that down because openness gets you killed because it gets you to try things in a dangerous environment. Whereas in an environment where the market is large and there's lots of innovations to be gained and entrepreneurship might actually pay a lot of the time, then openness to new experience is very good. So what I'm saying is there is no right answer because it depends on the like.
Yeah, I'm not questioning. Yeah, like my question was not like a
You have
universal. My
something in mind
question,
that you want to like you have like a thing. Yeah.
no, I don't really have a thing. It's just like, right. So typically, you see like people say like, "Oh, the world would be a better place if everyone was more kind," and it's like I'm not sure that's true.
I don't buy that.
Like,
Yeah.
yeah, like what does
Yeah.
kindness mean? And then two, it's
Yeah.
probably good that you have like assholes on the New York Stock Exchange trading for figuring out how to allocate resources slightly better, right? And like for me, I agree. It's like context dependent, right? Like the optimal set of traits is going to be different in hunter gatherer versus like early stage agricultural versus like early stage city versus industrial era. But it seems to me that there are like certain traits that would be preferable in certain environments. And I don't know, I haven't put a lot of thought into that. It's just like it feels like it's the other thing I'm trying to get at, which
It could be that there are, things that come from our ancestral environment that are mismatched to the modern world. I mean, an example that, a preference for eating sweet foods was really
yeah,
good when, detecting sweetness was an indication of vitamins and calories in a world where calories were scarce. But today it just leads to obesity, right? It could be, but
the other thing I'm just trying to get at, and maybe I'm not doing a very good job, is like, right, you have a framework for cultural evolution. And like part of it is we focus most of this discussion on cultural evolution itself, right? On like how it's changed these things. But the other way to like get at the framework is saying, look, let's change some of the parameters that are not cultural evolution, some of the inputs to cultural evolution. How does that change your views on like these outputs? And that
yeah,
is kind of a way to test like how to think about cultural evolution. To say like, okay, look, if we
yeah,
change kindness scale, if we change conformity scale, like how does that change how you think about cultural evolution and
yeah,
this like set of optimal traits? I'm not
yeah.
sure I'm doing a good job of articulating it, but that's like kind of what I'm trying to hint at.
It could be on my. I just might be misunderstanding you, but like I don't think it's the firmware that I wouldn't change the firmware because I think the stuff on top of the firmware, like the cultural traits, constraint. Like, let me give you an example. The dark triad, right? Psychopathy,
Yeah.
Machiavellianism, and narcissism, right? People generally think that this sucks and we should get rid of this thing. But I suspect that these traits are present in the population because A, we don't study them well. So we think that psychopaths are impulsive, and the reason I think we think psychopaths are impulsive is because we study them when they end up in jail.
The impulsive ones get caught. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. We catch the ones who get caught. And in reality, I think most CEOs and most even your the leaders that you might like, let's say Barack Obama. I bet Barack Obama is a psychopath. I bet he's a narcissist, and I bet he's Machiavellian because he's got to believe he's better than everyone else to like want to rise to the top. So he's a
Yeah.
narcissist. He's got to be Machiavellian to actually get there. And if you're dropping bombs on kids in another country, you got to be able to turn off the empathy, right? And maybe you want some people to be that way.
Yeah, part of this is also just going to be like, right, we've been talking about like situation and how that influences traits and using that to be like, I don't know, point in time, but there's also like point in society, right? And so even if Barack Obama didn't have those traits fully instantiated when he's 18 years old, right, like as he wins the elections, as he starts getting up there, right, like you start adopting more of these traits. But let me come up with a slightly different analogy to get this point to see if it makes sense. If not, we'll move to the next point. But like, right, you're using kind of the firmware, like hardware, software analogy, right?
Yeah.
And like one way we're talking about like Windows or Apple operating system or whatever, right? But one way to understand the software is to change the hardware a little bit, right? Like you change the hardware a little bit and you see how the software operates. And like the software is going to operate like a little bit differently depending on how the hardware is. And so my point is like, yeah, like we've been talking about the software all the time. Like, how do we think about like minor alterations to hardware and seeing how the software like interacts and like what parts of the software we want to tweak depending on what changes to the hardware. That's kind of, I don't know if that analogy works better, but that
Yeah,
was kind of
I
trying
get it. And
what I'm trying
I
to
guess
poke
my
at.
answer is I just don't have anything at that level because I think like a lot of it's virtualization and we don't. Maybe it's simply that as someone trained in cultural evolution, I don't think enough about the kind of low. I mean, okay, curiosity maybe. So I think given how the fast paced nature of the world, more curiosity and less confidence in what people believe would allow for maybe some increases in the pace of change. People get really locked in, and maybe a longer period of exploration versus exploitation. So we have these developmental periods where you're kind of what is it like your favorite songs are set by the time you're 18 or something, your favorite kind of music, like maybe a longer window on some of that stuff given the pace of change would be useful for cultural evolution. Yeah, but I don't think that that's really the I don't think the constraint is at the firmware.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It's not. It's more like a question of how to test intuition. It's an intuition pump for the software in terms of you change the firmware, and then that leads
Yeah,
to
okay, let's
forcing
let's
you to
let's
think
play,
differently about about
sure,
about changes in the software.
sure. Let's play with the intuition pump, right? So, for example, I think that if we weren't so conformist, right? And everybody like the fact that we have different views, that would be a disaster, actually,
Yeah.
because we would never be able to coordinate on anything. Most people don't have the time and energy and cognitive resources to be well informed enough to have good opinions. Most people shouldn't have opinions. They should
No.
actually be doing what they do, which is just follow what the crowd thinks.
I mean, yeah. You change the conformity dial, and in one case, like in conformity dial up, you get better social coordination, but you might get worse innovation, right? Conformity
That's
dial
right.
down, you get lower innovation or
Right.
better innovation, but perhaps
Mm.
worse social coordination.
Right.
And like depending on what of those you optimize for and what social context you're in
Right.
and how they might be instantiated,
Right.
that depends whether you want to do the dial. And
Right.
obviously, conformity dial is not it's part hardware, part software. Like
Right.
people probably have some genetic component that says I am open to new experiences, I am disagreeable or agreeable, but there's
Yeah.
obviously a major cultural component that instantiates as they learn and
Got it.
interact with the world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, yeah, that's right. And but again, I think I guess maybe maybe I'm just trying to find where we're differing is that there is no like human nature per se. Like there's a lot of variation and structured variation, and that's kind of important. So one example of this is like the way that innovation works, right? So in societies that tend to be more loose rather than tight, more kind of open to new experiences, you get more leaps in innovation, but you also get more inequality, right? Like so, Silicon Valley and just the general American tech sector it's a graveyard of failure. And the Asian tiger mom model actually works really well in environments where the cost is very high. More the population gets to move up, but it tends to harm radical innovation. It leads to kind of incremental innovation. So we see this in different parts of China. There's papers on that. We see this in Japan versus the United States. You see this kind of more incremental improvement, kaizen, shuhari, the bonsai, whatever, this kind of thing, rather than this kind of like, and now we're gonna have flying cars, And so I want both of those. Like I want Japan, I want China, and I want the United States.
Yeah, I mean, one kind of maybe counterfactual to make this a little bit more concrete, right? Like, what is it like? The understanding is like what 50,000 years ago there was kind of the any population outside of Africa went through a bottleneck of like 1,000 people, right? And let's assume a different minor tribe survived, right? Like that minor tribe survived probably somewhat due to their own skill and probably somewhat arbitrary being in the right place at the right time. And it's possible to imagine a different minor tribe survive with slightly different genetic and slightly different cultural features, right? Like what does the world look like today? And like I don't really know. I've never thought about this before, but it feels like it's not going to be exactly the same. There are going to be like slight differences, and feeling like how those
Yeah,
differences play up depending on like how that
yeah.
bottleneck differs. Like does feel like it's not a trivial question.
It could be, but I've seen no evidence to suggest that it would be all that different. Because I
Huh.
think so much of our cognition and so much of our values are not driven by that bottleneck. The difference between the like I'm not saying the genes don't play a role in this. I'm just saying that like I don't think that is what has led to the differences that we see across the world today. So
Even if not genes, even if they had like a slightly different starting culture, do you think that would have been outweighed by the subsequent history?
oh yeah, I mean I think path dependencies do matter. Like I think like the path
Yeah.
that China went down in its particular trajectory to do probably with its ecosystem and yeah, I think that's true. Compared to
So so
let's say
so so your intuition is like different kind of tribe makes it through the bottleneck 50,000 years ago. Different genes don't matter. Different culture probably does matter a little bit.
yeah, I think yeah, that's right. So I think the environment and so the ecosystem. So even things like agricultural practices, right? So
Yeah.
societies that practice plow agriculture tend to have a greater division of labor, even in second generation migrants, than societies that practice hoe agriculture because it required a greater degree of strength, right? That
Yeah.
was a product of the actual physical environment. Herder societies tend to have more honor culture. They are the descendants are in the South. They're
I
if you
yeah. I
yeah
agree with all of these examples. To me, it's interesting just because we have different intuitions about that, and I think we've agreed on most of the other parts on this call.
yeah
Is that my like I understand that like yeah, culture matters, my intuition is like 50,000 years would be enough for like the environment to determine cultural evolution substantially. So my intuition is that even if like, right, tribe makes it through bottleneck 50,000 years ago, because even with kind of a substantially different culture, because it would have to follow similar evolutionary paths constrained by environment, that feels less deterministic than perhaps a slight difference in genes. So that is just
Yeah, it's interesting. We just have a. Okay, so I guess let me share like what some of the stuff in some of, just share some of the stuff in my head, right? So a lot of the ways that we think we now know are endowed by our education system, really. So many societies in the past and even today, some small scale societies count like this: one, two, three, many. Right? They don't have a full counting system. The societies that do, they did it because they use stones as a metaphor, the app that they download in their minds, or stones notched into clay at the beginning of writing, or they use body parts. Like we use a decimal system. As you know, there's absolutely nothing special about the number 10. It could have been 8, right? In fact, I would lose 2 fingers so we could get back to 8 so I can map back to binary more easily. 10 sucks actually, right? So, yeah. So that ability to count is not a human ability. It's an ability that was endowed. And you can see like that's why it took us centuries to get to the concept of zero, because zero is real. There's no body part for zero. Zero stones or rocks is like zero. It's nothing, right? And right up until the 18th century. So there's a quote in my book from Francis Mazaries, who's this Canadian British mathematician. I guess all the Canadians were Brits. Who says negative numbers darken the very fabric of reality, or something like that, right? And it's because negative numbers are really hard to understand until we move to a new metaphor, and that metaphor was the number line. So we moved away from objects to movement and position, and that gave us a new metaphor that enabled us to think in new ways. Right. So that's numeracy. From my own data, if you think about things like logical reasoning, if P then Q cognition, syllogisms. Alexander Luria, 1920s, goes out to Uzbekistan. He asks people, where it snows, the bears are white. In Novaya Zimla, it snows, what color are the bears there? People with education were like, it's white. People without education were like, I've seen a black bear here once. Maybe black? Like like obviously humans can reason, like obviously, but it's a taught skill to some degree, right? The tendency to use these abstract categories and so on. So I guess like, if you look around you, like if you look at like the experience of the people that you interact with, even if you look at most of, history, right, in the last several centuries, you're dealing with a population that is so highly cultured that you think that that's what humans are like, and it's not. It's what like our particular cultural milieu is like, and that means that the latitude for what humans are capable of is actually a lot wider, and it is a lot less constrained than perhaps we think it is, and it just happens to be constrained in this ways. And so I guess that's where my intuition is coming from.
Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Well, you previously mentioned kind of freedom of speech as one of the core, let's say, values for continued evolution. Are there two other values? So let's say, what are your top 3 values? Like kind of based on your research, based on how it's informed your world understanding, right? What are these key things that values people should adopt, experiments people should run, like kind of broadly defined to make sure like we can get the benefits of cultural evolution over the coming centuries?
Yeah, I mean, if I had to put as number 1, it would be like freedom of speech. I think the blockers in a lot of these places are, corruption, and which are really just low scales of cooperation. People prioritizing family and friends over the state.
But is that a blocker to cultural evolution, or is that a blocker to economic growth? Like, let's differentiate these, because like they're similar. Like they're both important, but like I'm not sure they're the same.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a values person. Like, I think they're a blocker to cultural evolution insofar as I can talk out of 2 sides of my mouth on this one, right? So on the one hand, they prevent these communities from taking on ideas and taking on different ways of organizing themselves that would help them compete in the cultural marketplace. And at the moment, the only reason that they're able, but then on the other hand, the reason that they're able to exist in this way is because they're exploited by other groups that give them the resources that they would do. Otherwise, just market competition between states, wars or whatever, would eliminate this. There is always a race to the bottom, right? Like in evolution in general, the moment resources fall, you're more susceptible to disease and cancer and all of that stuff. And then the same is true in other places. Like the moment we're no longer exploiting these high energy resources with efficient technologies, then like when you're at war, you want Churchill in charge. You want like the best general you've got in charge of the war. But when the war is over, why not your brother-in-law? Why not Attlee, who converts the whole thing into a social welfare state? right? And so I don't know how to say that as a kind of like, what is the trait that's required to make that work? It's just the blockers to a lot of this stuff are these lower scales. Like Europe will bounce back, and like who are the successes? It's Europe and its daughters, right? Britain and its daughters, really. America, Canada, New Zealand, Australia. In other cases, we don't have a lot of examples of states that can on their own bring actually their own, because there are aspects of their culture that I think are valuable and ought to be recombined and would enrich the kind of cultural evolutionary landscape, but they're stuck in these places that and in these let's say cultural groups or regimes that prevent them from properly participating in the human story. I mean, just to end on this, I think if there's like, different people have like a North Star, right? Like a motivating thing. Mine is that like there's a thinking of humanity, there's this awful mismatch between opportunity and talent and opportunity. Like we don't know what humans are capable of. We know that Europeans in an era gone by were not at capacity, and when empowered, they were. And there is a lot of wasted computation on the planet, like human computation wasted on the planet because of circumstance of birth. And that is that's the autistic side. I mean, it's the inefficiency of the whole thing. Like meritocracy. Another example, I guess, is meritocracy. Like I would like to strengthen meritocracy, but do it in a way that we are still judging society on the on the best of us, the middle, and the least of us, right? Like we're judging it as the whole distribution, but we still allow for a system that is able to kind of rejuvenate. And if you read my book, a lot of the suggestions are kind of aligned with that, right? They're like, a lot of redistribution is distortionary. Is there a way to do it in a way that's non-distortionary? Hence things like land value taxes. Yeah. So you asked a broad question. I gave you a broad answer, Mark.
Cool. Well, great. Thanks so much for coming on. As a reminder, his book is A Theory of Everyone. Thanks for coming.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Loved it.
Thanks for listening to the Charter City podcast. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. You can follow us on your favorite podcasting platform or subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this conversation, we'd appreciate you sharing it on social media. Thanks for listening, and we hope to see you again.